all know that there is a crisis in Burlington, in the state of Vermont, and throughout this nation in terms of affordable housing. And we know that there is something absurd about a federal government spending tremendous monies on nuclear weaponry and cutting back, as Senator Leahy indicated, by 65% for affordable housing. And we know that there's something wrong. We're all over the state of Vermont. New housing is being built, but it takes you $200,000 or $300,000 to move into that housing, and we're not building affordable housing. Now, we learned, as everybody knew, several years ago, that there was a possibility that the 300+ units here, which are, this is the largest affordable housing development, to the best of my knowledge, in the entire state of Vermont. And we were absolutely determined that come hell or high water, we were not going to lose this amount of affordable housing. We were not going to see it converted into expensive housing. City of Burlington moved in a number of directions. Number one, as all of you will remember, we passed a condo conversion bill. So right away that said to the owners of this development, you're not simply going to convert this into condominium development. And I think that was an important step forward in terms of creating a kind of negotiating process that we want. Second of all, the city, working with the state, working with the federal government, Senator Leahy, created a framework by which we helped to bring together all of the cast of characters who are here today, the many people, the nonprofit, state, local, federal people. So I think we have made tremendous progress, and as Senator Leahy said, our goal here is not only to make sure that these 300+ units of housing remain affordable, but we're going to show the entire country that we're not going to sit back and allow decent, affordable housing to be converted to expensive housing. We need affordable housing. We've made a giant step forward, and we're going to continue going, and I just want to thank everybody for all of the work that they've done. Thank you.
How did this get started? Well, fortunately, Northgate had had a tenant association since 1981, and they had been quite active. When Bernie got elected mayor, they brought a lot of issues to the city about their housing, in particular the electric heat issue, because we have a municipal utility, and that was a city issue. And they were demanding some relief from their bills. I was working in the city's community development office then, and we were trying to pull together funding to do at least some insulation. We could see it was way beyond what we could afford, but we pieced together some money from the owners and the utility, and I got some CDBG funds to come in at least supplement the insulation here. It didn't really address the problem, but it was the best we could do. And in the process of doing that, we were researching the documents on the project and saw that indeed at year 20, the owner, like in 1989, the owner would be able to sell the project, and we thought it was a 40-year rent control project. That's how it works. And the city had just assisted in the development of the North Shore development in order to get bike path and parks and various things. And so we felt very responsible in the administration for the potential displacement of people here, because obviously these would make ideal condos, and they had the matching set next door. So it was always on the agenda of the Community Development Office in that administration to make sure that this project would not prepay. The city started to work on it through the Community Development Office. They assisted the Tenant Association, and in 1986 did a survey here to put a face on the people who lived here, to put some face on what would happen and humanize it. And the results showed that, you know, while the vast majority of people here were working, many of them had 2 working adults, that they would not be able to afford market rents in Burlington or market rents here, that 87% of them would not be able to buy a condo if it became a condo.
Well, we were all getting very nervous. Tension was very high prior to the buyout because there was talk of Northgate becoming condos. And most of us felt we just couldn't afford to live here, and we're feeling very trapped because there was no other place in Burlington we could afford to live. And then we got very excited about the buyout, but it was a very uneasy time for everybody because we weren't sure what was going to happen and what the timetable was and what effects the buyouts would have on us. Were our rents going to go up just the same, or, you know, what was going to happen? People were talking about preserving affordability, but in Burlington, affordable can mean $600 a month, you know, and to us that was not affordable.
Most of the renters out here were afraid of trying anything. I mean, anything they had tried just to get decent maintenance out here didn't work. So they were thought that they'd be kicked out or evicted or even worse maintenance than what they were getting if they made waves. So they were afraid to do anything constructive.
So it's not surprising that the tenants did not immediately come in droves to picket and demand that their housing be saved. It's not surprising that that impetus initially came from advocates, because we knew exactly how at risk that place was, and that there was a glimmer of a possibility that perhaps with some action and some arm twisting and some smart moves that we might be able to save it. But if I had been a tenant out there without the benefit of the knowledge that I have by being a low-income advocate, I probably wouldn't have gone to like 1 million meetings for something that was two years away and $21 million away.
The city quickly acted to pass a resolution that was passed unanimously by the Board of Aldermen, requiring the Community Development Office to undertake a buyout or whatever it took to save Northgate, and giving them a little bit of seed money to do the development work. They used the seed money to attract and pull together all the various groups who were concerned and wanting to save Northgate and bring them together and said, if you can come together as a task force and work together to do this, you can have this funding to do it. So indeed they did, and this was a church group called BEAM and the Tenant Association, Vermont Tenants Incorporated, Community Action, the City Housing Authority, the Planning Office, Community Development Office, and the State Housing Agency. So there were a lot of actors, everybody with their own idea of how to save Northgate, but at least now they had to come to the table and just start working it out.
The tenants were also represented in this organization, and that turned out to be critical, fundamental to the process, that their input and being able to identify and deal with their concerns was extremely important in the process. And it also tended to kind of humanize the process, make it a little more real, because the tenants could react to big financial proposals in a very basic way. This is going to impact our rent, and a lot of people are going to have trouble paying that kind of rent. So we need subsidies, or we need grants, or whatever. So it turned out to be a very, ultimately turned out to be a very symbiotic group.
I think that's the strain that comes through this whole enterprise, which cannot be overestimated. Many organizations put their own biases aside. Not that they didn't come up time and time again, but again and again, the overwhelming need, the hugeness of the challenge, I think brought out the best in everyone.
I did a couple of things right off. One was to organize this group into an entity that could buy the project, and created a nonprofit, worked with them to create a nonprofit corporation. But also the purpose there was to bring this group of people who all wanted to save Northgate but could not agree on how, or to have like one charter, one set of principles to move forward on, and that became Northgate Nonprofit. We set bylaws. We put 9 community members on the board and 3 residents, but several of the community members were intended to be votes that would be with the tenants. Like one was Vermont Tenants Incorporated, one was Community Action, and then the residents had their own seats as well, so they had support on that board. And then in the bylaws, we established the goals of the buyout. No one would be displaced. No one would pay more than 30% of their income to rent and utilities. Nobody, we would not change the income mix. There's a mix of incomes here from low right to market, and people here wanted to keep that the same. It's a good goal in a project this size. We also established that energy conservation would be part of it, and that the residents would have essentially, the way we set up the board votes, a veto power over the ownership structure, what it would be in the end, the rents, the management company. It was a goal of the residents to change the management here, and the rehab. So not only were residents to be in the process, but these things were established as being primarily in their hands. So at least we had a way to go forward then. In the interim, the state had created a couple of entities to support the preservation of this kind of housing. One was the Housing Conservation Trust Fund, and the other was Housing Vermont, which was and the Equity Fund. The problem with us was the same problem we ran into at HUD, which you probably heard in the description of the rehab funding, that everything was new. Every entity we were dealing with was new. Every program was new. The federal government had passed the Preservation Act, but they had not published any rules. No one would give you guidance how to do it. So we proceeded just on the basis, we want to buy it. What are our goals? I think what was very good about this process, and we've been in touch with a lot of other people doing it around the country, is we started from the perspective of what do we want as a community? What do the people who live there want? And then let's go to the programs and see how to get it, instead of what do the programs tell us to do?
The Northgate Task Force was meeting on a weekly basis at that point. They were, at that point, ready to create Northgate Nonprofit and become a 501c3 organization. So Housing Vermont, along with the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, began to attend those meetings on a weekly basis to really try and understand what needed to happen, both to purchase the property as well as to do a substantial rehabilitation of the property, which we felt was necessary if we wanted to purchase it. So it not only involved agreeing to a purchase price, which was the initial step, but also coming up with financial resources to accomplish the rehab.
The final price for the purchase and renovation of Northgate was $20.6 million. $10.2 million of this went for the acquisition of the property, $7 million for the rehabilitation, and the balance for related development costs. The funding was secured after 2 years of negotiations and collaboration with the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. The funding came from a number of sources. Initially, the City of Burlington allocated $159,000 in seed money to hire a coordinator whose job was to establish a nonprofit organization and raise funds for the buyout. The Burlington Electric Company, the local citizen-owned utility, provided Northgate with a $267,000 energy conservation grant. The grant was to cover part of the cost of the conversion from electric to gas heat and for retrofitting the buildings with new energy-efficient doors, windows, and insulation. As part of its rehabilitation plan, Northgate applied to HUD for a flexible subsidy rehab loan of $3 million. Another $1.2 million was a HUD discretionary grant for further rehab. This funding was frozen in the wake of the HUD scandals, but through the active support of Vermont Senator Pat Leahy, it was released in November of 1990. Unique to Vermont, the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board provided a low-interest loan of $3 million to finance a portion of the rehab. Northgate Nonprofit provided a loan of $428,000. The largest lender to Northgate was Vermont Housing Finance Agency. VHFA secured over $9 million from a variety of sources, including $1.2 million in tax-exempt bonds, and over $7 million came from wraparound notes and mortgages. In addition, VHFA created a new nonprofit, Housing Vermont, for the purpose of securing equity investment. Housing Vermont worked with the Bank of Vermont and the Federal National Mortgage Agency, or Fannie Mae, to procure $3.5 million of investment in exchange for low-income housing tax credits. $500,000 of this money came from the Bank of Vermont, a local Burlington bank, and the balance from Fannie Mae.
I think an opportunity to preserve a project that was very important for the community, mainly low and moderate income housing. I think there are 333 units, something like that in the development. That's extremely large by Vermont standards. And as a lot of people did, we could see that that had the risk of being lost to the community and would certainly put tremendous pressure on the community if that were lost. So we had a certain corporate citizenship attitude towards the thing, which we felt it was important that we participate.
Northgate's owned by limited partnership. A limited partnership is a way that the private sector owns real estate all the time, except that our limited partnership is created for a public purpose and is restricted with public purposes as a result of the kind of funding it gets. As, for example, the Housing Conservation Trust Fund put in $3 million and said, for our $3 million, we have a covenant on your property that says it will always be affordable. So it's like the residents gain control with some responsibility, but it's a responsibility that matches their goals, the goals of, you know, keeping it affordable and being able to stay. So because of having to create this limited partnership to raise equity, we had a complicated structure. There's no question. We would have liked it simpler. The general partners are Housing Vermont. They become a co-general partner in every project they assist around the state, but always in partnership with the local group, who becomes the other general partner, and that's us. Northgate Housing Inc. is local general partner, hires and fires the management company, establishes the policies for the project, runs the day-to-day affairs of the projects, and reports to these other more distant people.
On the other hand, the limited partners provide 99% of that capital, but have no participation in management on a day-to-day basis. They merely have provided capital to the limited partnership, and in return receive 99% of any tax benefits, which include the low-income housing tax credits, which is one of the primary reasons they made the investment.
Once the Northgate buyout took place, the tenants began to get more involved as part of the Northgate board and on active subcommittees. They made specific changes, including hiring a new management company and drafting a long overdue pet policy.
It's on the board of Northgate Housing Inc. that the tenants have representation, and right now they're minority representation, and over the next few years we'll keep getting a seat until they are a majority representation.
The 19 members on the board are very involved in the decision making. We have monthly residence meetings, which usually there's around 25 or 30 people at them, and those are the people that are involved and are interested and want their say in what's going on.
You've got people that are interested in the management, that are learning to read budgets. You've got people that are interested in just making sure everyone knows the same information. So they're putting out a newsletter. They're learning to print up a newsletter. Anything that you're just interested in and want to expand on, the association can help you. So you build up more of a cooperative spirit here at Northgate. People are more willing to help each other.
I don't think it takes a genius to know that a sense of ownership brings with it a sense of responsibility, and that the absence of that almost brings you the opposite. So what we've done is built in a time and provided the funds to train the residents in, you know, the kinds of talents and skills that one needs, and in a matter of several years that will have taken place.
Turn all of your, you know, it sounds corny, but it's true that you have to turn all of your problems into assets. You know, our problem was energy costs and the fact that the units needed so much rehab. So we had to make our project a model, a demonstration of energy conservation. You had to turn it into a success. You have to figure out what's unique about your project and build on that uniqueness to raise money and to gain the interest of people who have so many people knocking at their doors with need in this area. And so you have to be able to pull that out. You have to be, people will try to tell you that development is not political. Don't be political. It's development, it's business. Anybody who's ever gone to any kind of planning commission meeting in their town knows that development is extremely political. Developers are politicians. They never take no for an answer. They find out who needs what, and they go to those needs. You have to be political, and you have to be businesslike. And you will need that, especially as residents in affordable housing. You don't have money, so your power is in your strength in numbers and in your political clout.
I think we've created a model here of how that can be done, and done in such a way that the owners feel like they've been compensated fairly, but not at the expense of the tenants that have lived there. So from my perspective, perhaps more important than that actual project was the model and the technique that has been created that we'll be using, hopefully, to preserve many projects in Vermont.
And I think once people sense that they do have some control over their lives here, they'll start working together to build a community. And my vision for Northgate is to see it be a model not only for housing complexes, but for any community. You know, they could see what we've done here and what we're doing here and would say, hey, I like what's going on, let's see if we can get that going in our community.
Northgate Apartments is an affordable housing complex of 336 units, home to more than 1,500 Burlington residents. It is located in the city's new North End on 39 acres near Lake Champlain. Northgate was built in 1970 with a 20-year low-rent guarantee, which was scheduled to run out in 1990. For 3 years, low-income advocates, housing agencies, and financial institutions worked with the residents to engineer the buyout of the property and to secure rehab funds, which were greatly in need because Northgate had suffered years of deferred maintenance. The buyout and renovation cost $21 million. Of this, $7 million went for the rehab. Northgate's rehab began in January 1990 and was completed in November of that year, 1 year ahead of schedule. Over 100 tradespeople were on the site at any one time. The rehab included installing new heating systems, doors, windows, roofs, insulation, porches, and siding on the 54 buildings which were occupied during renovations.
Before the buyout, I think Northgate was a place where nobody really wanted to move to. I know when we were faced with that prospect, I felt like I was moving to the ghetto, you know. And when I first saw the inside of the apartment, I thought for sure I had moved to the ghetto.
Oh yeah, it was real cold. I mean, I had insulated windows, plus I had plastic on the windows, and I still would get the curtains moving in the breeze on a windy day outside. That's how much air got into the place. People's food would freeze in the cupboards. Your canned goods would freeze because it would be so cold. If it was below zero outside and you'd wash your floor, the water would freeze before it would evaporate. And so you couldn't wash on cold days, literally. It was so cold and so drafty out here. It was terrible.
So was it leaking in the where was all this cold air coming from?
Just coming
everywhere?
in from everywhere.
The cellar, the windows, the doors.
I mean, the back doors, we had slide doors, which you can see that they've changed now, which is really great.
That's right, you had the sliding...
Big slide glass doors.
We
had a 1/4 inch
Of
ice built up around it. We couldn't open and close it because the door handle fell off, and of course we had that big hole, and they wouldn't come and patch it. So we sort of taped it. You couldn't open it.
So this is the first time you've used this door in a number of years?
Yeah.
Many years.
Yeah, it's the first time we've had a door like
I mean, I
this, yeah.
sliced my hand right across here. Lucky it didn't go very deep, but struggling to open the door to let the dog go out.
It was uncomfortable, and, you know, they just made the best they could out of the situation, you know. It's always assumed that low-income people have to put up with whatever's there because that's all they can afford to live in.
Northgate residents knew they could not purchase the property without major renovation. As part of the Northgate nonprofit team, they worked with their project manager, architect, and contractor to map out a typical renovation project with one major difference. The housing would be occupied during renovation.
Mostly when they do housing, there's nobody living in it yet, and it's easy to forget that people will live in it, and it's easy to kind of build in things that you know will be problems down the road, but no one lives there yet. And the thing about doing occupied housing and doing Northgate was you could never forget that housing is people. It's about people, it's very fundamental. And we were, you know, the idea, the notion that we would do something halfway and then in 5 years this would be a slum and that would reflect on the people who lived here was just appalling to us.
Prior to the buyout, we had to figure out what the rehab would entail in order for the buyout to take place. So it was kind of this catch-22 that we didn't own the place yet, but we had to get in the apartments and find out what they needed. So we got access to a percentage that would hold up as a decent survey to 70 apartments. We did a survey with 256 questions per apartment that would let us know things about the conditions. And then we ran that through the computers and found what patterns there were and went from there in designing the scope of work.
The project really is fairly straightforward from the point of view of construction. There's not an awful lot that's unusual here. The types of work that we're doing, whether it's roofing or siding or installing windows, are all very straightforward. The thing that's really different about this is the fact that it is occupied housing. Whereas in most construction sites you've got no tenants or no occupants, you have a lot of freedom of your work hours, how you work, cleaning up at the end of the day, things like that. You're able to offer the contractor a pretty clean slate upon which to work. Here, the difficulty was to assemble a project, a description for contractors who, number one, had to bid on it, so that the description of the work and the scope of the work had to be very clear in order that everyone was given a fair chance, but also to describe to them how they were going to be allowed to work on a site in which people were living in the units in which they were trying to work each day.
We're working on 336 apartments, and we work around the residents. The units are occupied while we do the work. And that requires staff on our end to tell the residents what will be done in their apartment and what we require of them as far as moving furniture and watching their children and watching their pets and being careful regarding our safety concerns. And the more knowledgeable the residents are, the more successful the project is. And we've taken 11 and a half months to do the initial 3 stages of the rehab. What we do is we access people's apartments on 3 different occasions. The first phase, the access took 10 days, the second phase 12 days, and the third phase 8 days. The first phase was going throughout the site and putting in all the boilers and gas piping in the basements to accommodate the new the gas conversion from electric to gas heat and domestic hot water. Then phase 2 was going back through the site again in those same apartments and firing the boilers and putting in the hydronic baseboards to complete the heating systems. Phase 3 was the installation of new doors, windows, insulation, house wrap, siding, site grading, a lot of code items such as draft stops between all the apartments in the attics to prevent fire.
One of the things in terms of we were talking before about the magnitude of the project, for Wright and Morrissey, just juggling their supplies, getting their materials on site at the right time. We don't have enough room on the site to store all of the materials, but they've purchased all the materials up front to get the best price they could, to give us the best price that they could. So part of their job has been figuring out exactly when does that next truckload of 300 windows arrive. And on this particular project, we're looking at quantities like almost 3,000 windows, 250,000 square feet of roofing. I mean, we have enough material coming here to build a small town all to one site that's already developed that has no room to store anything. So for them, it's a constant process of trying to figure out when do we need something, where can we store it, how can we put it on the site. For Amy, that then confronts her with the issue of how many construction trailers can we really have in the parking lots at any given time, how many dumpsters of debris do we have out here, and are the tarps on every night, and are they cleaned out on the weekend so that the kids don't get into them.
What we also found as the strategy unraveled on the general rehab was that it seemed to be in our best interest to try to accelerate the general rehab schedule to pull the tail end much closer to the end of the heat fit up, which meant a number of things. It meant that we had to gear up our workforce. We have over 100 people out here now in our workforce. We had to gear up our own workforce to do it. We had to ask for the cooperation of Amy and Susan and Brenda and Tom to work quickly with us, because it meant addressing the problems that you were facing at a much more rapid pace. It accelerated their workload to a great degree. And, but again, it was one of those situations that as we started to move more quickly and at various points checked in with one another about what that meant, and finally got it to the point where it seemed to be workable on all ends, we actually have knocked off almost a year on the general rehab schedules. We anticipate being done in November of this year, with perhaps some spring seeding work and possible painting to come back and do. So essentially the heat fit up was the critical phase schedule-wise. The general rehab kind of followed in kind, and getting back to the team effort was only possible because everybody was willing to go along with that program. And the financing people and, you know, Brenda working with VHFA and Housing Vermont to also accelerate the funds in order for us to go that fast was also a component. So essentially it was 336 units in less than a year's time for the overall work.
I think one way we avoided monotony overtaking the people on the general construction was the pace. Every time they felt that they had it going pretty good, we stepped the pace up a little, so it gave them something else to work for, so that they, you know, they know every day that what they have to get done. And it was difficult at first setting it up, because, you know, at first they looked at us and said, we can't do that in a day. But once, you know, John made them see that, hey, you really can do this in a day. We really can do 2 of these units in a day. Now some days we do 4 units in a day with, you know, not the complete thing, but each task takes a day, and it's all overlapped, so that I think that's kept people from, and plus there's always somebody right behind you. You have to get your task done so that the guy coming the next day can perform his task. And if you don't, if you don't get your work done, it's rather glaring, because everybody behind you stacks up.
We make sure that the residents are completely informed. There are 1,350 residents. The way their lease reads, to some extent, this rehab is done only through their support. If they don't want us to access an apartment, we don't have the right to do so. So you have to have 1,350 people who are willing to have you come in and work in their apartment. It's got to be somewhat attractive, or at the least, you have to minimize how oppressive it is to people to have all their furniture moved, to have their lives disturbed the way we do. And so they know that we make that effort. They can see it. They, I think, have a great deal of faith in us, because we've tried to keep our promises with the residents. Those include 2-week notice on all work that will be done. The residents are notified 2 weeks in advance, then they're notified 2 days in advance. The work itself is described in detail to the residents, and most people on site could describe our scope of work as well as any of us. They know everything about what's going on around here, and they really feel like they're a part of it. They take a lot of ownership for the work that's taking place here, and I think that really helps on the morale side of things. Keeping all these people happy when we go into their apartment is essential for us, because we have to come back in. As Jeannie explained, we do it in different phases. We have 3 phases of work that travel through the site in kind of a serpentine fashion. They overlap at times. If we go in once and people have a bad experience, we'll be back twice again. And somehow we've got to keep on good terms with the residents. We've got to keep them happy and looking forward to the work down the road. So I think those are two of the very important points about doing unoccupied housing.
My apartment, my building, was among the first to be rehabbed. So the door and window conversion was kind of a nightmare. They hadn't got all their bugs down, so there was a lot of mess and a lot of confusion. What they're doing in 2 days now took them 5 days to do at that time. They did a really good job. It wasn't terribly invasive. Well, it was invasive. I shouldn't say that. They were very cooperative with the residents. They were very helpful. They tried very hard to come in and do what they had to do and leave and to pick up their messes. And so the people in the beginning got the hard part of the deal, but we were done, and it's really nice. It's made a big difference. My building was done in the first part of April, and it was still cool. And even though we still had the electric heat, just the addition of the doors and windows and the insulation made a tremendous difference in the comfort level of the apartments. On the other end, my apartment was among the last to have the gas conversion. So what was a nightmare for the people over on the other side was a breeze for me. I mean, they were in and out in 2 days, and it's great.
Biggest changes in Northgate, the physical change of how the property looks. It's more light and airy, and it looks clean and neat, and that caused a change in the residents' attitude about the property. They're more willing to keep it clean. They're more willing to upgrade their apartments by painting and doing things like making sure their kids don't vandalize the property in the area. And the general attitude of the residents, they're more upbeat about whether they can get their repairs done. A lot less complaining is going on. You know, they're more willing to join in the committees and the work that's necessary to keep the association going. So there's been quite a lot of changes that have been affected with the purchase.
In the past year, well, we've had to shift our lives around. I mean, our bedrooms, our houses, our lifestyles to make do for the rehab. However, you know, it's been for the better. It's changing. I mean, because I remember Northgate in the late 70s and early 80s, and it wasn't exactly the greatest place to live. And now it's become something that I'm proud to say, I live at Northgate.
We knew going into this process we would have a lot of problems and a lot of challenges. We were working around 1,500 people in occupied housing. To my knowledge, it hadn't been done, or I certainly hadn't done it before. I had no experience with it, and I felt we had no choice but to create a team that had a great reputation for working together. To get an architect who's the kind of person that that doesn't protect themselves with memos, create some designs for you, and then just throw up their hands when the contractors can't implement them on site. And we chose a contractor who would work with us, who wouldn't take advantage of us on change orders, who would understand the nature of this work. We really needed for people to have a clear vision of what it would be like to work around all these people and what things they should be concerned with. If we heard answers like, we're concerned about theft, we're concerned about fraternization between the workers and the employees. We're concerned about heavy equipment around small children. That's the kind of thinking we want people to have. If they don't think that way, you can't make them. So those are the kind of qualities we looked for, and I think it really served us well in the long run.
Northgate Apartments is an affordable housing complex of 336 units, home to more than 1,500 Burlington residents. It is located in the city's new North End on 39 acres near Lake Champlain. Northgate was built in 1970 with a 20-year low-rent guarantee, which was scheduled to run out in 1990. For 3 years, low-income advocates, housing agencies, and financial institutions worked with the residents to engineer the buyout of the property and to secure rehab funds, which were greatly in need because Northgate had suffered years of deferred maintenance. The buyout and renovation cost $21 million. Of this, $7 million went for the rehab. Northgate's rehab began in January 1990 and was completed in November of that year, 1 year ahead of schedule. Over 100 tradespeople were on the site at any one time. The rehab included installing new heating systems, doors, windows, roofs, insulation, porches, and siding on the 54 buildings which were occupied during renovations. The buyout and renovation of Northgate achieved many firsts. Among them was the fact that more than 20% of the tradespeople on the site were women.
Well, I think it all starts with the Women in Construction Trades Ordinance, which was an ordinance passed 4 years ago in the city of Burlington. The ordinance's purpose was to get women in the trades, and it did so by mandating a goal of 10% women in all trades on jobs of over $50,000 in which there were either city funds or federal funds which had been funneled through the city. Where Northgate has been an absolutely incredible project is that from the very beginning there was a commitment to hire women and to hire women in numbers. So that instead of having what I've traditionally had is maybe 8, 9, or 10% women on a job site, here suddenly we had 20% women and consistently throughout the job. Wright & Morrissey began with no women on the crew in January. By March, they were in a hiring mode. They started hiring women, and at that point we hit 19–20%, and we've maintained that now for the last year.
The other component out here that is very, very new and different for our company, and I've never really seen it on any other jobs, is the great number of women that we have in our workforce. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is this project falls under the Burlington City Ordinance for women in the trades. And I think one approach that we took on this job was that we weren't going to look at that ordinance as a restrictive kind of this is what you have to go out and do, but rather we looked at it more as trying to address the spirit of the ordinance, which was to involve women in entry-level positions in construction.
Approximately, Wright & Morrissey's workforce out here is about 110 people. We also have probably another about 35 or 40 people, maybe, about maybe another 50 subs out here on the job. Of that total workforce, Wright & Morrissey has about 15 or 20 women, and the subs have probably another combination of maybe another 5 or 6 women. As far as working with the women, it's been basically the same as working with the guys. We don't have as many skilled women or as skilled as the men, but the women who are here that work, they work just like the guys. They work just as hard as they do. The ones who are skilled know their task well. It really hasn't been any different than working with the guys.
One of the things that's made the women on the job work is because it was made known from day one that no discrimination of any kind would be tolerated. And from the top, we were adamant about that. And I think people got the word, and they realized that they had a job to do, and I haven't heard of anything. God help them if I do, but there just there hasn't seemed to be been any problems that I'm aware of, that I know of in integrating the workforce, and it's just gone along fine.
When the job first started, I have to say it was pretty traditional, and I think in stereotypic construction workers, and mostly male. And as time went on, I think that we came to understand that the people who set the negative tones on construction sites are a minority, and other people go along with it as because of peer pressure. But I think because this job was supervised by women, I think that had a lot to do with it. That Jeannie Morrissey heads up the Wright and Morrissey construction end of it, and Susan Marks and I head up the on-site representation of the owner and the architect, and the architects. The inspector of all the work is a woman as well. So they became very familiar with not only interacting with women, but having women supervise them. And I think that no one abused the authority, but just proved that they were skilled in what they did, and it had a real trickle-down effect through the crews, and I think that a lot of the women were well received.
In the 60s, it was a rarity. I mean, you almost never saw it. In the early 70s, when they built the thruway up through here, there probably wasn't 2 women on the whole of 89 from White River to St. Albans. But in the late 70s, it started to change. You know, people got to want to do this work, and sometimes it's less than glamorous when you're putting in footings in November in the snow and the mud. It's hard to find anybody that really thinks it's wonderful work.
The reality is that it's still a real challenge for women who want to get trade jobs. It's still considered man's work. And because of that, there's still fewer opportunities for women to get the training or for them to be encouraged into the training that exists. Once getting the training or going out onto the job site, they're often the only woman on that site. And they're dealing with incredible isolation. And the other thing they deal with is sexual harassment. And those are the 2 reasons, sexual harassment and isolation, that women end up leaving the trades.
They used to do things like, this is true, like move this pile of railroad ties from over there to over there. And then when I get done, not there, like 10 feet from there. And things like having me snow plow the yard and not tell me where all the I-beams were. Things like send me to the landfill when it was raining. Took me like 3 times to realize, after getting stuck for the 3rd time, that that was on purpose. Things like send me to the metal scrapyard in a truck that spit bolts down Main Street. I can't believe to this day I didn't get arrested. Things like yell at me, call me, you know, stupid, slow. You know, this was like kind of the old school back then.
The other crew I worked on, it was the first time that any of them had worked with women to begin with. They didn't like the idea. They didn't give us any credit for knowing anything. And these guys do. They don't assume that we're, you know, stupid, that kind of thing.
In Vermont, we've developed a training program called Step Up for Women. And Step Up trains women for entry-level jobs in the trades. There are 3 sites here in Vermont. Burlington, through the City Hall, is one of those sites. And we provide women with a hands-on skilled training that they need to get that job, and also with the real, telling them and training them about the real issues that they will face as women out on the job site, so they know how to deal with those barriers and are successful at overcoming them.
Yeah, I'm a Step Up graduate. And for me, the skills were pretty basic, but it gave me a lot of confidence. It was at a time where I really needed to go through a program with other single parents trying to get out into the working world again, especially construction, because it's hard. So it did help me through a bad time. I think it's a really good program. The instructors are great. It was good to be in there with other people with the same difficulties and the same problems that you're going through. It was a good program.
I did Step Up, and we did carpentry, electricity, and auto. And of course I'm doing the carpentry part. And I really got into, when we did the sheds, I did a trim on the window of the shed, and now I'm doing trim here, and I like it a lot.
My job is basically to supervise the 4 different paint crews. There's the exterior paint crew taking care of the exterior trim, the interior paint crew taking care of the interior trim, a crew in the shop, taking care of doors, spray painting, that kind of thing, and a punch crew going through and taking up all the little stuff.
I've done a lot of different things in this job. This is the second crew I've been on here, and I've learned a lot. I've done a lot of different skills on this job.
Like what?
I did
She's
the
practically single-handedly built this whole place.
And I did the, I've done gas panels, dryer vents, sheetrock, plate replacement. I'm up on the roof now, pouring cement, a lot of demolition.
I think it's a change of attitude for the guys to know that we have women and we should respect the women on the site. They do know, in some cases, a lot more than the men. And I think the guys have this ego problem of women don't know much about construction, and I think they're wrong. I think they have to be able to take the time to listen to them and understand them and give them that time. I think they can learn something over it as well as the women can learn from us. I think it's a big team effort, and to give them all that chance I've enjoyed it.
Their attitude has impressed most of the other people on the crew, whereas before, a lot of people not being used to working with women in the trades had sort of a redneck, I guess you could say, attitude about it until they actually did it and broke the ice. And everybody got along. The camaraderie was excellent.
You know, I told Kim when she was considering coming up that she wasn't to expect any favoritism or, you know, I knew from experience, I'd seen her around the job, I knew she could, you know, carry her own weight, and, but we just had a talk while she was, you know, deciding whether to switch jobs or not, and I told her that there wasn't, you know, she was going to have to do what everybody else did, including the grunt work and all the heavy carrying, and everything's been fine.
I think the biggest surprise was we were the commodity of being able, all of us, to work together towards that one goal, and I think that's really been achieved, and I think it shows throughout Northgate and Northfield project here. I think we've all come together and put out a heck of a product.
Every once in a while, being in the trades, you come upon a job where everybody gets together and everybody gets along and clicks. And that all goes back to the question of attitude. And it's always been my motto that if you don't like it, don't do it. And it's just so much easier to do when everybody gets along.
The morale out here is something like none of us have ever experienced on a job site before, as you may see from the other people to be interviewed. And people have changed and evolved and grown into a different kind of work attitude than any other place I've seen.
The women on the construction job have really helped to set a tone of the construction job that we needed set anyway for the residents and the families. You couldn't have the construction crews having the kind of freedom and atmosphere that they have when they're on a job site all by themselves, and it's primarily young single men, and so I think it's really helped in that effort, and it's just come sort of more naturally by having more women on the job.
I'm on one hand delighted that we've had this chance to experiment with a substantial number of women on the job site, and I think it's proven to me what I've always sort of felt, namely we have to be there in numbers or we won't survive in the trades. It's also proven to me that to have women on the job site in great numbers changes the nature, the ambience of the job site, and that men and women can start pulling together when there are women there in numbers. That instead of isolating or ostracizing the woman, she comes on board. This job site has been unique in creating a situation where the schedule has become the common enemy, and men and women have to work together because you're in a race against time.
All in all, I'm very happy the way things have gone out here on the cruise. It's just kind of a pleasure and a little bit of a miracle to see how many women we had out here the kind of job that they've done and the people that they've enlightened. I think that every woman who works in construction, and particularly those that work hard and are very good at what they do, change the people they're working with for the better. Being a woman in construction is a difficult and challenging situation, but out here I think that it was a more positive situation than most, and I think that it was a confidence builder for people because they were allowed the time to get right in and do their work as opposed to kind of have to wait for a lot of opportunities, and that it probably helped the speed of the growth of the workforce, whether they go on to work with us on another job or whether they go on to another employer or whether they go back to other classes or to high schools or to grade schools to help share their experiences. I think that all in all, Northgate has been a big shot in the arm for women in this industry.
Northgate Apartments is home to over 330 Burlington families. Built in the 1960s, Northgate was and continues to be the largest source of affordable housing for low and moderate income residents in the entire state of Vermont. Private developers joined with the federal government to build Northgate and to provide the units at below market rents. After 20 years, however, which brings us to the late 1980s, Northgate's owners were free to sell the units or rent them for market rents, which meant that the units would no longer be affordable and that most of Northgate's residents could no longer afford to live here.
Partly because when Northgate was built, of course, that was seen as the out beyond where no one would want to live anyway, and the buildings were cheaply built. No one really cared about that particular area of town. In the interim, however, it became a very desirable part of town. And the sort of financing that it was like a time clock that was about to go off, and those units would be lost to low-income people forever, which in this town would have been a major loss. Northgate is, population-wise, I think, bigger than the town of Huntington, and that is a huge, for Vermont, a huge community, and one that was severely at risk.
The participation of the federal government resulted in a great deal of money being provided to Vermont to build family housing, for example, in the 60s and in the 70s. And as a result of that federal support, there were many units of affordable housing built in Vermont and in Burlington and Chittenden County. And they were decent, safe, and affordable. Pretty good places to live. However, the residents were not involved. I mean, the developers of those projects were private developers. Had no experience in organizing, and there were no incentives in those programs to spend any real-time dealing with organizing residents, involving residents, or dealing with the social aspects of, you know, having a community that's called the rental housing project. And I think that's, I think that a place becomes a better place to live when you give residents the opportunity to participate.
The previous management team out there did everything they could, as is often the case with property managers, to disempower the people there. They wanted tenants that paid the rent and didn't complain and didn't care if things didn't get fixed, and that would be silent. So if you've lived in an atmosphere like that for 15 years, it takes a lot of time and belief in that you're not going to get kicked out or that you can speak up.
Most of the renters out here were afraid of trying anything. I mean, anything they had tried just to get decent maintenance out here didn't work. So they were thought that they'd be kicked out or evicted or even worse maintenance than what they were getting if they made waves. So they were afraid to do anything constructive.
At that time, the Northgate Residents Association, a small but dedicated group, understood what it meant if Northgate could no longer be affordable. They joined with Burlington's Mayor Bernie Sanders, city departments, state agencies, nonprofit developers, and the federal government to raise enough money, $10 million, to purchase Northgate Apartments. They went farther than that and raised over $7 million for the rehabilitation of Northgate. That is, for new windows, doors, porches, siding, roofs, and the conversion from the expensive electric to more economical gas heat.
These group of people became the Northgate Task Force, and the task force later became Northgate Nonprofit. And Northgate Nonprofit and the Residents Association formed a cooperation, and the cooperation is the legal owner of Northgate now. So we were able to raise the money, we were able to meet with the owners and come up with a deal that they could live with. And we own the property now, and we're learning to manage it.
Once the buyout took place, we began to see some fairly immediate changes. There was change in management. The residents were asked to give input on things like house rules. One of the first ones that came up was the pet issue, and that was how I got involved in Northgate. We hadn't been very involved here for the first 7.5 years, but the pet issue was something I felt very strongly about and got involved through that. And through the process of working through the changes and getting to know residents here that were also involved either on the pro side or the negative side of the pet issue, we began to see that residents, what we were being told about being able to affect changes here was really true, and that this management and the NHI board were willing to listen.
Since the buyout, Northgate residents have become more involved in the operation of Northgate Apartments. They were part of the team that engineered the buyout, made specific recommendations for the rehabilitation of this property, hired the new management company, and sit on the board of Northgate Housing, Inc., the nonprofit organization that runs the daily operations of Northgate Apartments. Every resident is a member of the Northgate Residents Association, which has a 19-member board and several active subcommittees. From the welcoming committee that made this videotape, to budget and finance, bylaws, grievance, pet issues, and newsletters, just to name a few, Northgate residents are working together as neighbors to make their home an even better place to live.
Not only do we have a new appearance, but there's just so much going on now here. We have built a sense of community here, and it's really important for residents to get involved in that. We all have a stake in it, and we're really hoping that we can turn Northgate into a great place for people to live or raise their families.
We've heard comments from people that have never even noticed that we existed until we changed the appearance, and now they say, oh, these look so much like nice new condos, and it's like, well, it's home to us. It's more than just condominiums. But also the interior work. We've changed to gas heat now, which makes Our building's much more efficient to heat. Also, the windows and doors have been added. So I think it's like a flower that's taken a long time to bloom. We're just starting to bloom now, and hopefully the beauty of it will be able to be seen now, whereas before we were just kind of a scraggly looking sort of plant that took second place to everybody else.
Because Northgate is a community, it feels similar to any other place you rent. You pay the landlord the rent and you go about your own business. But if you dig just a little bit deeper, it's not. You've got people that are interested in the management, that are learning to read budgets. You've got people that are interested in just making sure everyone knows the same information. So they're putting out a newsletter. They're learning to print up a newsletter. Anything that you're just interested in and want to expand on, the association can help you. So you build up more of a cooperative spirit here at Northgate. People are more willing to help each other.
I have seen people take tremendous risks and undertake things that they probably have never done before. And for all I know, if they lived someplace else, they never would do. And they've done it with courage and goodwill, sense of humor, and they've really made some tremendous changes in this community for everyone's benefit.
For the future, there's so much potential for Northgate. I mean, even the way it's set up with the courtyards, you're in a situation where it would be easy to get to know people now, you know, and I think once people sense that they do have some control over their lives here, they'll start working together to build a community. My vision for Northgate is to see it be a model not only for housing complexes, but for any community. You know, they could see what we've done here and what we're doing here and would say, hey, I like what's going on, let's see if we can get that going in our community.
It is spring, 1991. This is the Northgate apartment complex in Burlington, Vermont. It didn't always look or feel like this. Built in 1969 and 70, the Northgate rental housing complex was the largest in the state and represented 1/4 of Burlington's affordable housing. Rents were less than half of comparable housing. But as the 336 families living at Northgate soon learned, low rents did not necessarily mean affordable housing. When energy costs increased dramatically in the early 1970s, the cold Vermont winters brought a chilling reality to tenants at Northgate. Poor construction and substandard insulation in their buildings meant heating bills that were often higher than their rents.
The highest bill was $405 I had to pay for the lights and electric heat.
The drafts didn't come in just around the windows, they came through them. It was terrible.
It was cold, very cold. In the wintertime, we couldn't mop the floors when it got below zero because it would freeze. Mop water would freeze on the floors.
One day we were just commenting on the fact that the apartments were so windy inside because of poor insulation and because there was a lot of air infiltration around the windows and such. And so just for the fun of it, I took a piece of yarn out and hung it up in the air, and it actually stood out on end because it was so windy in the apartments, and that's what we were dealing with as far as the air infiltration. And with that, you can well imagine how much the heating bills were.
Couldn't get any maintenance work. So I hired everybody to come in to do everything. My painting every 2 years because the paint they had was outrageous.
This is the story of the new Northgate and the creation of an energy conservation program that can serve as a model for preserving affordable housing everywhere.
Folks' electric bills were double and triple the rent in the winter. That wasn't even the worst of it. The worst of it was they couldn't get warm, and you couldn't really live in the house and feel like you weren't living in a tenement or something, because you're hanging plastic on the windows and then blankets over that, and it was pretty depressing. And so the resident association first came to the city as its strongest voice to get help, in fact, in dealing with the energy issues and deferred maintenance, and trying to get the owners to meet the law and to maintain the properties. The city responded to them by offering them some money and technical assistance to get some information out to the community about their plight. And they started by doing a survey with the resident association and the local tenant organization that to find out who lived here and would they stay and what their needs were and what would happen to them if it became condos. And it was that survey that convinced city government to pass a condo conversion ordinance that protected the tenants on that front. And then the whole awareness of that campaign led to the creation of a community task force to look at the problem of Northgate and what could happen. The city then, following that ordinance, charged their community development office with working with the resident group towards a buyout and towards the renovations for Northgate.
The philosophy of the city in the early to mid-'80s was to expand low-income housing opportunities throughout the city. However, there were a lot of people out there who were paying more in their energy bills than they were for their rent. So it was, quote, affordable housing. But when you looked at the total cost, they were actually paying a lot more than some people in the marketplace. The city was very supportive. Moreover, the Burlington Electric Department, during the process, approached us with the Department of Energy grant application that they had, and they wanted to do something to get this application done so that they could bring an energy person on board to monitor energy usage, to instruct tenants on new technology, and so forth. So BED was very vital in bringing that grant forward.
It just doesn't make sense anymore to heat with electricity. We believe in buying local generation, and our people, our voters in Burlington, voted $11.3 million in bonding to do conservation and demand-side projects. And so when we got the chance to participate in a fuel switch at Northgate, we really seized that opportunity. And Burlington Electric, I believe, contributed $267,500 towards the Northgate effort. Along with that, we applied for a DOE grant for an educator to work with the tenants at Northgate and also to supply valuable information to Burlington Electric.
BED committed to convert Northgate from electric to gas, heat, and hot water. Their grant, along with $3.75 million raised from 9 other sources, was used to retrofit the buildings with new energy-efficient windows, doors, and insulation. After years of living in cold, drafty, anything but affordable housing, the tenants of Northgate prepared themselves for construction.
The main thing it required was common sense. When we designed the scope of work, we took a year to do it, and that year included a lot of analysis of what we had on site, what the residents' experience had been living here, what specialists in the field of energy, of manufacturing, of landscaping, I mean every skill we could gather. To hire the architect, we went and solicited qualifications from 6 architectural firms. We ended up choosing who we did based on personal style as well as skills and the size of their firm. That was a big issue because we knew if we got down to the crunch, we'd need a big staff to pull the work off. And in fact, that happened many times. So we needed to use, they have a staff of 12, we needed them all simultaneously to meet deadlines.
We tried to look at where we could get the most payback for the dollars that we were going to be able to put into the project. During the planning process, one of the major issues for us became trying to balance a variety of sometimes conflicting goals, of trying to solve a lot of technical problems, of trying to solve energy issues, and of also trying to improve the quality of life for the people here on the site. In general, we did most of our decision-making based on a balance between the cost-effectiveness of the energy improvements and their impact on the lifestyle and the quality of life for the residents here at Northgate.
Construction began on January 24th, 1990. The simplest approach would have been to move the 336 families out of their homes, do the construction, then move them back in. But that would have been much too expensive. The most cost-efficient way was to do the construction to apartments that were occupied, in and around the residents and their lives. It could have been a logistical nightmare, but it wasn't.
I think one of the key parts of the success of Northgate was the communication with residents, because we couldn't have finished the project without their cooperation. And we gave residents 2-week notification telling them exactly what work was going to be happening and what day. And the notification also let them know exactly what they had to do in order to prepare for the work in terms of moving furniture or clearing stairways. We provided several services. One service was a moving service, and that was any resident could call us up and say, I need help moving stuff in my basement, or I can't move the couch in the living room. So we would send over somebody who would help them move their furniture, or we'd send 2 people over to move the whole thing. Once they got their 2-week notice, they could call us and say, yes, we would like to have somebody come and sit in our apartment when workers are in there. And we would provide them with somebody to sit in the apartment anytime a worker was in there. During all of last summer, the fall, the winter and spring, Northgate was a construction site, and construction sites are very dangerous. There was a lot of heavy equipment, a lot of materials on site that were potentially dangerous to kids, and we worked really closely with Wright and Morrissey to have them be aware that kids were all over the site and that they had to be very conscious of them at all times, and they were great.
Yeah, I was really surprised just how well it did work out. I anticipated some problems, having worked a little bit of construction at one time myself and worked, around that sort of thing. And I figured it'd be a real big hassle, and I was surprised just how smoothly it did come off. They did a real good job of it. Sure, we were inconvenienced at times, but that's to be expected considering the scope of the work they did. They did a fine job.
Communication was very open, and I liked that very much.
They did send out notifications to all the residents. They did 2 weeks and 1 week, and they also did 48-hour notifications. They were very good about it, and they also supplied house sitting.
It can be extremely hazardous, but the way they had each work site cordoned off, and every day they cleaned up extremely well, right from nails to any materials were all put away. The men were very cautious and careful with the children in the area, and they were kept out. And as far as my knowledge is, we didn't have any incidents with the children at all.
The construction phase was completed in November 1990, 8 months ahead of schedule. But the conservation project was not over yet. During the next summer, new energy-efficient refrigerators were delivered and installed in all of the apartments. And the conservation specialist funded by BED came on board to educate and assist the residents in the fundamentals of energy conservation.
My first task was to help people understand their programmable thermostats. What my role does here at Northgate has helped people equalize the variations in heating bills that they saw before. I also have acted as general troubleshooter if somebody has too much condensation in their apartment, or if they're feeling a draft in one particular place. I go and I help maintenance out in troubleshooting that particular problem. Part of what I do is also to do a study of before and after energy savings, and that information is going to be analyzed by the Lawrence Berkeley Lab and myself, and that information will help other places like Northgate make these kinds of energy decisions that have to be made in the process of rehabilitating 25-year-old apartments.
One of Northgate's great successes, I think, is that it demonstrates that energy conservation is essential to affordable housing. I've worked in affordable housing for years in winter climates, and it's amazing how rarely people have made that equation. And in our case in the city, we had an added incentive with the municipal utility to save on the use of electric heat and peak power electricity. There was a community-wide benefit.
Before the rehab, many residents in the winter months had to make a choice between paying their rent or paying their heating bill. And now that choice doesn't exist anymore. They have enough money to pay both, and that's what affordable housing should be.
The Northgate story is really the story of a group of people who shared a common vision and who did whatever it took to make that vision a reality. But they not only preserved Northgate as affordable housing, they actually improved the quality of life for all of the residents living there. Today, Northgate is a thriving, revitalized community. The benefits of the energy conservation program go far beyond warmer homes and reduced utility bills.
Yeah, there's more of a sense of community, more sense of belonging, of, ownership.
And now I have money to buy extra food and clothing, and I can even take a trip.
We have pictures from before, and to look at a before and after picture, even living here, it's hard to believe it's the same place.
Pride. I mean, now that the place looks decent, people aren't afraid to say they live in Northgate. They're not embarrassed by it anymore.
We're all like a family now. We get to talk to each other more, and we do things for each other now. It's like a big family. That's before it wasn't. The neighbors wouldn't get together and talk like that. Now I can see that we're going to get along a lot better than we did. It's like a family here.
When people come by and say, hey, Northgate really did it. So I really taken pride in living in Northgate.
Fantastic.
Fantastic.
I'd say the same.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
Warm.
Comfortable.
It's a great place to live.
It's wonderful. It's just wonderful.
Take one. The final price for the purchase and renovation of Northgate was $20.6 million. Over 2 years in negotiation and collaboration of public, private, and nonprofit organizations resulted in funding that came from 6 primary sources. To begin the project, the City of Burlington contributed $159,000 of seed money. The Vermont Housing Finance Agency acted as a mortgage agency and a land leaser, and worked with HUD and the seller to raise $7 million in tax-exempt bonds. The equity investments were organized by Housing Vermont, and the investments included $2.8 million from Fannie Mae and $500,000 from the Bank of Vermont. The general partners of Northgate contributed $34,000 towards the purchase. HUD provided over $15 million in housing vouchers, which got the project going and is not included in the purchase price. They did come up with flexible subsidy loan for the rehab of over $3 million and community development block grant funds. The Vermont Housing Conservation Trust Fund, funded by the taxpayers of the state of Vermont, allocated roughly $3 million as one of their first projects towards the rehab and purchase of Northgate. And finally, the Burlington Electric Department, the city's municipal utility, contributed $167,000 towards the conversion from electric to gas heat.